It was December 23, 1990, in the quiet suburban neighborhood of St. Catharines, Ontario. A city nestled between Toronto and Niagara Falls, known for its tree-lined streets, modest homes, and the kind of Christmas traditions that made it feel timeless. Snow dusted the rooftops, colored lights blinked in windows. Families were wrapping presents, baking cookies, preparing for the holiday. In the Homolka household on Dundonald Street, the mood was festive. Dorothy and Carol Homolka had raised 3 daughters in this home. Laurie, the eldest, then Carla, and finally Tammy, the youngest, who had just turned 15. That evening, laughter echoed through the living room as the family decorated the tree, exchanged small gifts and posed for photographs. Carla's fiancé, Paul Bernardo, was there too, camera in hand, capturing cheerful moments on videotape. He was 26, handsome, well-dressed, polite to Carla's parents, the kind of young man who seemed to have his life together. He and Carla had been engaged for over a year. Their wedding was planned for the following summer. No one in that house suspected that within hours, this ordinary Christmas Eve would become the beginning of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Canadian history. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. By the early hours of December 24th, the house had gone quiet. Everyone had gone to bed, but sometime after midnight, Carla dialed 911 in a panic. Her younger sister, Tammy, was unconscious in the basement, not breathing. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but despite their efforts, Tammy could not be revived. She was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at the hospital. The official cause, according to the coroner, was accidental alcohol poisoning. Carla told investigators that Tammy had been drinking during the family gathering and had simply passed out. She mentioned that her sister sometimes experimented with tranquilizers, trying to make the explanation sound plausible. The family was devastated. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. The funeral was held quietly. Within 3 months, the case was officially closed. To everyone, her parents, the police, the medical examiner, it was a tragic accident. A young girl who had made a terrible mistake. No one questioned it further. But in the years that followed, investigators would learn that Tammy Homolka's death was not an accident at all. It was the first in a series of crimes that would reveal a darkness no one in that peaceful suburb could have imagined. To understand how this happened, we need to go back further, to the lives of the 2 people at the center of this case. Carla Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Port Credit, Ontario, a small lakeside community just outside Toronto. Her father, Carol, worked as a traveling salesman while her mother, Dorothy, managed the household. The family was devoutly Catholic, attended church regularly, and maintained a reputation for being respectable and close-knit. Carla's childhood was unremarkable in the best sense. She did well in school, participated in extracurricular activities, and seemed to get along with her sisters. By the time she reached adolescence, Carla had developed a confident, outgoing personality. Teachers described her as bright and responsible. Classmates admired her. She was popular, attractive, and ambitious. During her years at Sir Winston Churchill Secondary School, she joined a social group known as the Diamond Club, an all-girls clique that, according to some accounts, encouraged its members to focus on appearance, charm, and strategic relationships. There were rumors that the group's philosophy centered on marrying well and using beauty and intelligence to climb socially. Whether or not Carla took these ideas seriously, she certainly seemed to embody them. Outside of school, she worked part-time at a local pet store, where she was friendly with customers and showed a genuine affection for animals. By all outward appearances, Carla was a typical teenage girl with a bright future ahead of her. Paul Bernardo's childhood, by contrast, was far more troubled. Born on August 27, 1964, in the Scarborough district of Toronto, Paul grew up in a household marked by tension and secrecy. His mother, Marilyn, struggled with severe depression and was reportedly emotionally distant. His father, Kenneth, was cold and authoritarian. The family dynamics were strained, and Paul later claimed to have been subjected to verbal abuse and neglect. Despite this, he worked hard to create a different image for himself. He excelled academically, took on part-time jobs, and cultivated the persona of a charming, successful young man. By the time he graduated from the University of Toronto with a degree in accounting, Paul had learned how to present himself as confident, articulate, and likable. But beneath that polished exterior, something darker was developing. During his high school and college years, Paul's attitude toward women began to shift. He surrounded himself with friends who treated relationships as conquests, who bragged about manipulation and control. Paul adopted similar behaviors. He was attractive and charismatic, which made it easy for him to meet women, but those who got close to him began to notice troubling patterns: possessiveness, jealousy, flashes of cruelty. Still, few could have predicted what he would become. In October 1987, Paul attended a work conference at a hotel restaurant in Scarborough. Carla, then 17, was working there as a server. They met in the dining room, and according to both of them, the attraction was immediate. Carla was drawn to his confidence, his ambition, his polished appearance. Paul saw in her something he had been searching for, someone who not only adored him, but seemed willing to indulge his fantasies. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Paul showered her with gifts, took her to expensive dinners, and made her feel special in ways she had never experienced. Carla, in turn, became deeply attached. She introduced him to her family, and the Homolkas liked him. He was respectful, helpful around the house, and clearly devoted to their daughter. By early 1988, Paul had given Carla a ring, and though they were not yet formally engaged, she wore it proudly and spoke of him constantly to her friends. To everyone around them, they seemed like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and madly in love. But during this same period, something terrifying was happening in the streets of Scarborough. Beginning in May 1987, a series of brutal sexual assaults began to terrorize the area. Young women were being attacked near bus stops, in parking lots, and on quiet residential streets. The attacks followed a consistent pattern. The assailant would approach from behind, often late at night, overpower his victim, and assault her violently before fleeing. The attacks were calculated, methodical, and left investigators with little physical evidence. The local media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the Scarborough Rapist, and the case became one of the most high-profile criminal investigations in the Greater Toronto area. Police conducted extensive interviews, collected DNA samples from suspects, and urged women to travel in groups and avoid walking alone after dark. The community was terrified. Parents kept their daughters indoors. Neighborhood watch groups formed, but despite the heightened police presence, the attacks continued. In November 1987, a friend of Paul Bernardo contacted the police with a troubling tip. She told investigators that Paul had made unsettling comments about women, that his behavior seemed consistent with the profile of the Scarborough Rapist, and that she felt compelled to report him. Police took the tip seriously. They interviewed Paul, who agreed to cooperate fully. He provided a DNA sample, answered their questions calmly, and maintained his innocence throughout. The investigators who spoke with him found him articulate, cooperative, and seemingly unlikely to be involved. He had a steady job, a serious girlfriend, and no prior criminal record. They noted the tip in their files and moved on to other leads. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. Paul's DNA sample was logged into the system, but due to an overwhelming backlog at the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, it would not be tested for more than 2 years. During that time, Paul Bernardo remained free, and the attacks continued. Meanwhile, Paul's relationship with Carla deepened. He became a regular presence in the Homolka home, often staying for dinner or spending weekends with the family. Carla's parents trusted him. Her sisters liked him. He was charming, funny, and seemed genuinely devoted to Carla. But behind closed doors, the relationship was beginning to change. Paul's sexual demands became increasingly extreme. He introduced Carla to violent pornography, pressured her into role-playing scenarios, and began expressing disturbing fantasies. Carla, eager to please him and terrified of losing him, went along with much of what he asked. She later claimed that she felt powerless to refuse, that Paul's moods were unpredictable, and that she feared what might happen if she said no. Whether this was entirely true, or whether Carla was more complicit than she later admitted, remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. What is certain is that by the time Paul proposed marriage in December 1989, their relationship had become deeply dysfunctional. Carla accepted the proposal with excitement. She showed off her engagement ring to friends and family, planned the wedding with enthusiasm, and seemed thrilled at the prospect of becoming Mrs. Bernardo. But Paul's obsessions were growing darker. He had become fixated on Carla's younger sister, Tammy. He made comments about her appearance, filmed her during family gatherings, and spoke to Carla about his attraction to her. Rather than objecting or distancing herself from Paul, Carla made a decision that would have unthinkable consequences. She agreed to help him. In December 1990, Carla was working as a veterinary assistant at a clinic in St. Catharines. She had access to controlled substances, including sedatives and anesthetics used on animals during surgery. She stole a bottle of halothane, a powerful anesthetic, and brought it home. On the night of December 23rd, after the family Christmas gathering had ended and everyone had gone to bed, Carla gave Tammy an alcoholic drink laced with crushed sleeping pills. Once her sister was unconscious, Carla and Paul carried her down to the basement. They applied the halothane-soaked cloth to her face and began to assault her while filming the entire ordeal on videotape. But the drug was too strong. Tammy stopped breathing. Panicked, they tried to revive her, but it was too late. They cleaned up the scene, dressed her, and carried her upstairs to make it appear she had simply passed out after drinking too much. Then Carla called 911. The paramedics who arrived found Tammy unresponsive, her lips tinged blue, vomit on her clothing. They attempted resuscitation but were unable to save her. At the hospital, doctors concluded that she had died from choking on her own vomit after consuming too much alcohol. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental. No autopsy was performed. No one suspected foul play. Carla played the role of the devastated older sister. She wept at the funeral, comforted her parents, and spoke of how much she would miss Tammy. Paul too appeared genuinely sorrowful. He attended the funeral, offered his condolences to the family, and gave no indication that he had been involved in any way. In the months that followed, Carla returned to work at another veterinary clinic and quietly abandoned her plans to attend university, despite having been accepted to 2 schools. Life seemed to move forward, but for Carla and Paul, Tammy's death was not the end of their crimes. It was only the beginning. By the spring of 1991, Paul had lost his job as an accountant. Rather than admitting this to Carla or his family, he began smuggling cigarettes across the United States-Canada border to make money. He told Carla he was still employed and continued to present himself as financially stable. But his behavior was becoming more erratic. He was drinking heavily, his temper was worsening, and his sexual demands were growing more violent. Carla, meanwhile, was planning their wedding with the same enthusiasm she had shown throughout their engagement. She wanted a grand ceremony, a horse-drawn carriage, a reception with champagne and fine food. She seemed determined to create the fairy tale wedding she had always imagined. The ceremony was set for June 29, 1991. Invitations were sent. The venue was booked. Carla's family was excited. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, Paul and Carla committed another horrific crime. In April 1991, Carla invited a 15-year-old girl named Jane Doe, a pseudonym used in court documents to protect her identity, to their home. Jane had worked with Carla at the pet store and looked up to her as a glamorous older friend. Carla offered her a drink laced with sedatives. Once the girl was unconscious, Paul and Carla assaulted her while filming the attack. The next morning, Jane woke up feeling sick and disoriented. She believed she had simply drunk too much and left the house without suspecting what had happened. She would not learn the truth until years later, when police showed her the videotape. On June 29, 1991, Carla and Paul were married in a lavish ceremony at a historic church in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Carla arrived in a white horse-drawn carriage, her dress elaborate and elegant. The reception was held at a nearby hall, where guests toasted the couple and danced late into the night. To everyone present, they seemed like the perfect couple, young, attractive, deeply in love. But while they celebrated their union, a horrifying discovery was being made just a few miles away. On June 29th, the dismembered remains of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey were found in a lake near St. Catharines. Her body had been encased in concrete blocks, which had been dumped in the water. The blocks had surfaced due to shifting currents, and a fisherman had spotted them and called police. Investigators who arrived at the scene were horrified by what they found. Leslie's body had been cut into pieces, the concrete carefully poured to conceal the remains. Her braces and dental records were used to confirm her identity. The brutality of the crime left no doubt that she had been tortured before being killed, but there were no clear leads, no witnesses, and no immediate suspects. Leslie Mahaffey had disappeared 2 weeks earlier, on June 15, 1991. She had been at a friend's house that evening and had missed her curfew. When she arrived home after midnight, she found the doors locked. Her parents had a strict rule about curfews, and rather than waking them, Leslie decided to walk to a nearby plaza to use a payphone. She called several friends, hoping someone might let her stay over, but no one was available. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Her family reported her missing the next morning, and police immediately began searching. Leslie was a bright, spirited teenager, sometimes rebellious but always in contact with her family. When she stopped answering calls, her mother knew something was terribly wrong. Now, 2 weeks later, her worst fears had been confirmed. The discovery of Leslie's body sent shockwaves through the community. Parents kept their children indoors. Schools held assemblies about safety. Police held press conferences, urging anyone with information to come forward. But despite an intensive investigation, no arrests were made. The case went cold. Nearly a year later, on April 16, 1992, another young girl vanished. 15-year-old Kristen French was walking home from school in St. Catharines when she disappeared in broad daylight. Unlike Leslie, Kristen was disciplined, responsible, and deeply connected to her family. She attended Holy Cross Catholic Secondary School, earned top grades, and competed successfully in figure skating. She had won several medals and was training for a regional competition. Every day after school, Kristen walked home along the same route. She was punctual, reliable, and always called if she was going to be late. When she didn't arrive home at her usual time, her mother, Donna French, immediately knew something was wrong. She called the school, called Kristen's friends, and then called the police. Within hours, a full-scale search was underway. Investigators quickly determined that Kristen had not run away. Her belongings, her school bag, her coat, her skating medals, were all at home. There was no reason for her to leave voluntarily. This was a criminal abduction. Police canvassed the neighborhood where Kristen was last seen. They found fragments of a torn map, one of her shoes, and strands of her long brown hair scattered on the ground. Witnesses came forward, but their statements were frustratingly vague. Most could only agree on one detail. The abductor's car appeared to be a dark-colored Chevrolet Camaro. Police immediately began tracking every Camaro registered in the area, following lead after lead. But as the investigation progressed, they realized the witnesses had been mistaken. The car was not a Camaro at all, it was a gold Nissan 240 SX. This was a critical breakthrough, but by then 2 weeks had already passed. On April 30th, 1992, Kristen's body was discovered in a wooded area near Burlington, about 15 miles from where she had been abducted. Unlike Leslie's remains, Kristen's body had not been dismembered. Her hair had been cut short, likely in an attempt to hinder identification, but she was otherwise intact. The autopsy revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and killed. Because her body had not been dismembered like Leslie's, investigators initially believed the two cases were unrelated. But behind the scenes, patterns were beginning to emerge. In late 1992 and early 1993, two major developments shifted the trajectory of the investigation. First, the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto finally began testing the backlog of DNA samples that had been collected during the Scarborough rapist investigation. Among those samples was the one provided by Paul Bernardo in November 1987, more than 5 years earlier. When the results came back, they were a match. Paul Bernardo's DNA was consistent with the biological evidence recovered from multiple sexual assault victims in Scarborough. Police immediately began surveillance on him, but they did not yet have enough evidence to make an arrest. They needed more. The second development came from an unexpected source. In January 1993, Carla Bernardo arrived at work at a veterinary clinic in St. Catharines with severe bruises around her eyes and face. Her co-workers were alarmed. The injuries were unmistakable. Someone had beaten her badly. When they asked what had happened, Carla claimed she had been in a car accident. No one believed her. Concerned, they contacted her parents. Dorothy and Karol Homolka immediately drove to Carla's home and insisted on taking her to the hospital. There, doctors documented extensive bruising, facial trauma, and other injuries consistent with domestic violence. When questioned by police, Karla broke down. She said she was terrified of her husband. The abuse, she explained, had started months earlier and had been escalating. Paul had beaten her with a flashlight during a violent argument. She was afraid for her life. Paul Bernardo was arrested on charges of domestic assault. He was questioned, provided a statement, and was released shortly afterward. But the arrest had triggered something else. Karla moved out of their home and went to stay with relatives. She also began speaking with detectives from the sexual assault unit. At first, she said little, but as the conversations continued, she began to reveal more. She told investigators that Paul was violent, controlling and obsessed with dominating women. She described his collection of violent pornography, his disturbing fantasies, and his increasingly erratic behavior. She did not yet mention the murders, but police were beginning to suspect that Paul Bernardo was involved in far more than domestic violence. On February 17, 1993, police executed a search warrant at the Bernardo home in Port Dalhousie, a quiet suburb of St. Catharines. The house was a small two-story bungalow on Bayview Drive, painted pink and surrounded by a white picket fence. It looked like the home of a young, happy couple. But inside, investigators found a trove of disturbing material. Shelves filled with violent pornographic books and videotapes, handwritten notes describing sexual assaults, receipts for concrete and other materials, and most critically, biological evidence linking Paul Bernardo to Leslie Mahaffey's murder. Among the items seized was a receipt for concrete purchased on June 15, 1991, the same day Leslie had disappeared. Police also found traces of her DNA in the house, but the most damning evidence had not yet been discovered. During the initial search, investigators missed a critical hiding place. Hidden in the ceiling of an upstairs bathroom was a collection of homemade videotapes. These tapes, which would later be found by Paul's lawyer and turned over to police, contained footage of the assaults on Tammy Homolka, Jane Doe, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French. The tapes showed, in horrifying detail, that both Paul and Karla had participated in the crimes. Karla was not just a witness, she was an active accomplice. When confronted with this evidence, Karla's lawyer, George Walker, moved quickly to negotiate a deal. He knew that the videotapes would destroy Karla's claim that she had been a battered wife, forced to participate against her will. But he also knew that without Karla's cooperation, the Crown's case against Paul might be weaker. Walker proposed a deal. In exchange for her full testimony against Paul, Karla would plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and receive a sentence of 12 years to be served concurrently. She would also be evaluated by psychiatrists and could potentially serve her time in a psychiatric facility rather than a traditional prison. The Crown, after consulting with investigators and forensic experts, agreed. The deal was finalized in May 1993. Public reaction to the plea deal was immediate and furious. When news broke that Karla Homolka would serve only 12 years for her role in multiple murders, outrage erupted across Canada. Victims' families, legal experts, and members of the public condemned the deal as a miscarriage of justice. Critics argued that Karla was just as responsible as Paul, that she had actively participated in the crimes, and that she should have faced murder charges. But the Crown defended the decision. Prosecutors argued that without Karla's cooperation, they might not have been able to secure a conviction against Paul. They pointed to the psychiatric evaluations, which concluded that Karla had been suffering from battered woman syndrome and had acted out of fear and dependency. They also noted that at the time the deal was negotiated, the full extent of the videotape evidence had not yet been revealed. Once the tapes were found, the deal could not be undone. It was a legally binding agreement. On July 1, 1993, Karla Homolka appeared in court to enter her guilty plea. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' advocates, and members of the public. Karla, dressed conservatively and speaking softly, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. She was also ordered to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The judge, Justice Francis Kovacs, explained that the sentence reflected the Crown's belief that Carla had been coerced and manipulated by Paul, and that her testimony would be essential in securing his conviction. But many in the courtroom were unconvinced. They saw Carla as a calculating manipulator who had used the legal system to escape justice. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs demanding harsher penalties. Victims' families spoke to the media, their voices filled with anger and grief. The case had become a national scandal. 2 years later, in May 1995, Paul Bernardo finally stood trial for the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, as well as more than 40 sexual assaults committed during his time as the Scarborough rapist. The trial was held in Toronto and was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Canadian history. Security was tight. The courtroom was closed to the public during the most graphic portions of the trial, particularly when the videotapes were shown to the jury. Carla Bernardo, now divorced from Paul and living under a new name, was the Crown's star witness. She testified for 17 days, describing in detail the events leading up to and including the murders. She portrayed herself as a victim, manipulated, coerced, and terrorized by Paul. She claimed that she had been too afraid to leave, too dependent on him to resist. She said that Paul had threatened to kill her if she did not participate. But under cross-examination, Paul's defense team attacked her credibility. They accused her of lying, of minimizing her own role, and of using the plea deal to escape responsibility. They pointed to inconsistencies in her statements, to her calm demeanor in the videotapes, and to evidence that she had on at least one occasion acted independently of Paul. But the videotapes themselves were the most damning evidence against Paul. They showed him orchestrating the assaults, directing Carla, and reveling in the violence. They left no doubt that he was the primary perpetrator. On September 1st, 1995, after deliberating for less than a day, the jury returned a verdict. Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. For his safety, he was placed in solitary confinement at Kingston Penitentiary, one of Canada's most secure federal prisons. Inmates convicted of crimes against children are never safe in the general prison population, and Paul's notoriety made him a target. Carla, meanwhile, began serving her sentence at the Prison for Women in Kingston, Ontario. She was later transferred to Joliet Institution, a medium security facility in Quebec. Behind bars, Carla appeared to transform. She maintained good behavior, participated in therapy, and enrolled in a university correspondence program, eventually earning a degree in psychology with excellent grades. She gave interviews to psychologists and criminologists, cooperated with authorities, and expressed what some interpreted as remorse. Others saw it as calculated performance. Her older sister, Laurie, continued to support her throughout her incarceration, visiting regularly and encouraging her to rebuild her life once she was released. But Carla's younger sister, Tammy, was dead. Leslie Mahaffey's family had lost their daughter. Kristen French's parents would never see her graduate, never watch her compete again, never walk her down the aisle. The damage was irreversible. On July 4, 2005, after serving her full 12-year sentence, Carla Homolka was released from prison. She walked out of Stay-An-Des-Plaines Institution in Quebec under strict conditions. She was prohibited from contacting known criminals, forbidden from working with children, and required to report regularly to parole officers. But she was free. Just days before her release, Paul Bernardo gave a new statement to his lawyer. In it, he claimed that it had been Carla, not him, who had insisted that Leslie and Kristen be killed. He said he had wanted to release them, but that Carla had argued they would identify them to police. The statement reignited public debate and fueled further outrage. Victims' families called for a review of the plea deal. Legal experts questioned whether Carla had manipulated the justice system, but there was nothing to be done. The sentence had been served. Carla's release was met with media frenzy. Reporters tracked her movements, published photographs of her, and interviewed anyone who had encountered her. Within weeks, a local newspaper published allegations that Carla was still in contact with known criminals, violating the terms of her release. Carla denied the claims. In a rare interview, she said that she simply wanted to rebuild her life, that she understood the conditions she had to live under, and that she resented being portrayed as a danger to society. She said she had done her time and deserved a second chance. By 2010, reports surfaced that Carla might apply for a pardon under Canada's Criminal Records Act. A pardon would not erase her criminal record, but it would seal it from public view, making it harder for employers, landlords, or others to access. The possibility sparked immediate backlash. Victims' advocates organized protests. Politicians condemned the idea. Within months, the Canadian government passed new legislation, Bill C-23A, also known as Eliminating Pardons for Serious Crimes Act, which made it significantly harder for individuals convicted of serious violent crimes to obtain pardons. The law was widely seen as a direct response to Carla's case. 2 years later, in 2012, a journalist tracked Carla down to the Caribbean island of Guadeloupe, a French overseas territory. She was living there under a new name, had remarried, and had become a mother of 3 young children. Photographs published in the media showed her tan, thinner, and cautiously navigating life as a suburban mother. Neighbors interviewed by the press described her as polite, reserved, and devoted to her children. Some had no idea who she was. Others recognized her but chose to say nothing. Then in 2017, Carla's name returned to the headlines once again. Reports revealed that she had volunteered at a private elementary school in Montreal where her children were enrolled. She had accompanied students on a field trip and had brought her dog to a classroom activity as part of a reading program. Though she was never left alone with children and had followed all school protocols, the revelation caused outrage among parents. Many had no idea that a woman convicted of manslaughter in the deaths of 2 teenage girls was volunteering at their children's school. The school quickly updated its policies to ban anyone with a criminal record from volunteering, effectively ending Carla's involvement. The incident reignited the debate that had surrounded her since her release. Can someone who committed such heinous crimes ever truly be rehabilitated? Should they be allowed to reintegrate into society, to have children, to live quietly among others who have no idea of their past? Or does the nature of their crimes, particularly crimes involving the torture and murder of children, place them permanently outside the boundaries of redemption? Paul Bernardo remains in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times and is considered a dangerous offender. He is housed in a maximum security facility and is unlikely ever to be released. Carla Homolka, on the other hand, has lived freely for nearly 2 decades. She has remarried, raised children, and attempted to build a life far removed from the crimes she committed. But her past follows her. Every few years, her name resurfaces in the media. Journalists track her down. Victims' families speak out. The public debates whether justice was truly served. The case of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka remains one of the most controversial in Canadian legal history, not only because of the brutality of the crimes, but because of the questions it raises about complicity, coercion, and the limits of the justice system. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the individuals involved. It exposed critical failures in law enforcement, particularly the years-long delay in processing DNA evidence that allowed Paul to continue committing crimes even after he had been identified as a suspect. It sparked debates about plea bargains and whether prosecutors should have the authority to offer lenient sentences in exchange for testimony, particularly in cases involving multiple victims. It raised difficult questions about domestic violence, psychological manipulation, and the extent to which a person can be held accountable for crimes committed under coercion. And it forced Canadian society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it hides behind a charming smile, a respectable job, a fairy tale wedding. Sometimes it lives in a pink house with a white picket fence. And sometimes, by the time we recognize it, it is already too late.